The events that unfolded in Minneapolis sent shockwaves across the nation and ignited a moral reckoning that extended far beyond state lines. At the center of the storm was the killing of Alex Jeffrey Prey, a man whose final moments were captured on video and shared widely across social media, sparking outrage, grief, and an escalating national debate over power, accountability, and the use of force by federal authorities. According to eyewitness footage, Alex Prey arrived at a protest where tensions were already high. Protesters were facing aggressive crowd control tactics, including pepper spray. Video shows Prey attempting to assist a female protester who appeared to be in distress. Within moments, federal officers moved toward him. He was tackled to the ground, sprayed directly in the face, struck, and disarmed. What followed next would become the most contested and disturbing moment of the incident. Prey was shot multiple times while on the ground. In the immediate aftermath, federal officials claimed that Prey posed a lethal threat, asserting that he was brandishing a firearm and intended to carry out violence. However, video evidence contradicted those claims. Multiple angles showed that Prey's firearm remained holstered until an officer forcibly removed it, independent legal. Experts later confirmed that Prey possessed a valid concealed carry permit and that no footage showed him aiming or drawing his weapon. As the video circulated, the initial narrative promoted by federal authorities began to unravel. Public confidence eroded further when officials continued to repeat claims that were no longer supported by visual evidence. The gap between what people saw and what they were being told grew wider by the hour. Political fallout followed swiftly. Statements from federal leaders framed the killing as a justified response, suggesting that anyone who lawfully carries a firearm to a protest risks being killed by law enforcement. That position triggered immediate backlash from civil liberties organizations, Second Amendment advocates, and constitutional scholars who warned that such rhetoric undermined lawful gun ownership and due process. The response from Minnesota's business community marked a turning point. More than 60 chief executives, represented through the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, issued a rare public letter calling for de-escalation and accountability. While carefully worded, the statement acknowledged tragic loss of life and urged federal, state, and local leaders to work together to prevent further harm. Behind the language of cooperation was an unmistakable signal. The situation had crossed a line. Athletes and cultural figures soon joined the chorus. The National Basketball Players Association released a statement declaring that players could no longer remain silent in the face of civil liberties being threatened. They emphasized that free speech and the right to protest were foundational principles that must be protected for everyone. That same week, a professional basketball game took place in Minneapolis under an unusually somber atmosphere. Players, coaches, and fans alike acknowledged the weight hanging over the city. Post-game interviews reflected a sense of grief and disbelief. Coaches described it as one of the saddest environments they had ever experienced. In professional sports, noting that the pain of the city was palpable inside the arena. As criticism mounted, federal leadership appeared increasingly defensive. In public remarks, the president reiterated his claim that he opposed violence but repeatedly emphasized the presence of a firearm, despite clear evidence that it was legally carried and never brandished. Civil rights groups accused the administration of selectively defending constitutional rights depending on political convenience. The contrast between federal officials and Minnesota's state leadership grew sharper. The governor addressed the public with visible emotion, describing a climate of fear spreading through communities. He spoke of children afraid to leave their homes and families uncertain of their safety. He framed the crisis not as a partisan conflict, but as a question of basic morality and human decency. Federal enforcement leadership, however, took a starkly different tone. When questioned about accountability, officials described those killed as suspects and insisted the real victims were the officers involved. In doing so, they dismissed concerns raised by video evidence and grieving families, further inflaming public anger. Adding to the controversy were comments suggesting that parents had used their own children as shields during enforcement actions, statements widely condemned as dehumanizing and inflammatory. Advocacy groups argued that such language served to justify excessive force rather than prevent it. Polling data soon reflected the shift in public opinion. A significant majority of Americans rejected the claim that the shooting was justified. Even polling outlets historically favorable to the administration showed declining approval, particularly on immigration enforcement. Former presidents issued rare public statements. They described the killing as a tragic failure and warned that core national values were under assault. Their words echoed what many Americans were already feeling. that something fundamental had broken. Friends and former colleagues of Alex Prey shared memories that painted a portrait starkly different from the official narrative. They described him as kind, selfless, and consistently willing to help others. Many emphasized that his final act, stepping in to assist someone being harmed, was entirely consistent with who he was. As protests continued, symbols of dissent appeared throughout the city. Messages calling for accountability were visible in public spaces and even inside sports arenas. What had begun as a local tragedy had become a national flashpoint. Members of Congress responded by demanding concrete actions, including the withdrawal of federal enforcement units from the city, removal of masks from officers, an end to the detention of U.S. citizens, and independent investigations into the killings. They warned that funding for federal agencies should be contingent on meaningful reform and transparency. Through it all, one question continued to dominate public discourse. How did a lawful act carrying a permitted, concealed firearm while attempting to help another person end in death? And why did the official response appear more focused on defending power than confronting truth? As the nation watched, Minneapolis became a mirror reflecting a broader struggle over authority, accountability, and the meaning of justice. What happened to Alex Jeffrey Prey was no longer just about one man or one city. It had become a defining moment, forcing Americans to confront whether the systems meant to protect them were instead being used to silence, intimidate, and kill. And for many, the debate was no longer political. It was moral. The moral question only deepened as new details continued to surface. Independent analysts reviewed the footage frame by frame, noting how quickly the encounter escalated and how little time appeared to pass between Prey being forced to the ground and the shots being fired. Former law enforcement professionals publicly questioned whether standard de-escalation protocols were followed at all. Several pointed out that once Prey was disarmed and restrained, the justification for lethal force became extraordinarily difficult to explain. Legal scholars emphasize that concealed carry laws exist precisely to allow individuals to lawfully possess firearms without provoking fear or confrontation. They warned that redefining lawful possession as an automatic threat at protests effectively nullified those rights in practice. If such a standard were allowed to stand, they argued constitutional protections would become conditional rather than guaranteed. As pressure mounted, federal agencies announced internal reviews, though critics quickly noted that these investigations lacked independence. Civil rights organizations called for special prosecutors and transparent evidence releases, arguing that trust could not be restored through closed-door reviews conducted by the same institutions involved in the killing. Meanwhile, the rhetoric coming from federal leadership grew increasingly combative. Rather than acknowledging contradictions in the official account, statements focused on law and order messaging, portraying protests as inherently dangerous and dissent as a threat to national stability. This framing further alienated moderate voices, who had initially sought balance and restraint. In Minnesota, community gatherings turned into vigils. Candles, flowers, and handwritten notes filled public squares. Strangers embraced, shared stories, and asked the same unanswered questions. Faith leaders, educators, and medical professionals spoke publicly about trauma spreading through neighborhoods, particularly among children, and immigrants who feared that any public presence could invite violence. The economic impact also became impossible to ignore. Events were canceled, businesses closed early, and workers stayed home out of fear. Local leaders warned that continued federal occupation would inflict lasting damage on the city's economy and social fabric. The earlier statement from business leaders now appeared less like a call for calm and more like an alarm. International observers took notice as well. Foreign media outlets covered the incident extensively, comparing the footage to scenes more commonly associated with authoritarian crackdowns than democratic societies. Human rights organizations requested information and signaled that the case could draw global scrutiny if accountability was not established. At the center of it all remained a single unresolved truth: Alex Prey did not need to die. That belief unified groups that rarely found common ground: gun rights advocates, civil liberties groups, athletes, business leaders, and everyday citizens. Their shared outrage was rooted not in ideology, but in the visible disconnect between the facts on the ground and the power structures refusing to acknowledge them. As weeks passed, the administration's attempts to redirect attention to cultural grievances, symbolic projects, and unrelated controversies failed to quiet the growing demand for answers. Each deflection only reinforced the perception that leadership was unwilling to confront the consequences of its own actions. The question facing the country became unavoidable. Would this moment fade into another unresolved headline, or would it mark a turning point where force was finally met with accountability? History suggested that such moments rarely announce their outcomes in advance. They are shaped by what follows, by whether institutions bend toward transparency or retreat further into denial. For Minnesota, the path forward remained uncertain. For the nation, the implications were profound. The killing of Alex Jeffrey Prey had exposed fractures that could no longer be ignored. Whether those fractures would be repaired or widened depended not on statements or slogans, but on actions yet to be taken. And as the cameras eventually moved on, one reality endured. A family was left without a son, a community without a sense of safety, and a country confronted with the consequences of power exercised without restraint. If justice was to mean anything at all, it would have to begin there,